I'd like to start actually, Anik, thank you for that very touching kind of homage and description then of your mother, and realizing that this is the journey actually makes this additionally special. And then to Marie, Frederick, Sophie, who's probably out there somewhere, my thanks for this opportunity to be able to be here and share with you my enthusiasm for ecology, evolution, and then my hopes then for cancer. And to paraphrase a line, most of you know Bob Gatenby, and you can tell I'm no Bob Gatenby. So very sorry that he's not here, and he also would prefer to be able to be here. But what I'm going to try to do then, I've kind of broken up material that we might have shown, and I've broken up, so the first part then I'd like to be able to discuss sort of basic principles. Some of them we have touched upon, so talk about some basic principles then of ecology and evolution, how it may apply to cancer, how I like to view cancer and we view cancer, and then bring it to, in the second part, to actually adaptive therapy and what it means. I'm an evolutionary ecologist. My background, my career has been applying principles of evolution by natural selection to try to understand wildlife species. So in the past, my lab has worked in very diverse areas. My lab at UIC still continues to work with aardvarks, coral reef fish, black-footed ferrets, deer, and a variety of other species. And I've discovered over my career that really it is my colleagues and my graduate students who have always picked my study organism. And then Tom Vincent, he was my game theory mentor. Sadly, he died of pancreatic cancer in 2009. He was kind of, to again kind of use a bit of sort of Yiddish and Hebrew, he was kind of a yentl. He decided that Bob and I should hook up. He would do things like, when I'd be out in Arizona, Bob at that time was department head of radiology at the University of Arizona. He'd invite us over to his house, sit us down on the couch, and then say, oh, I've got to go run some errands. Why don't you two just sit here and get to know each other? At any rate, so in the process of getting to know Bob, and all of you know he's a remarkable person, a Renaissance thinker, a wonderful human being, an amazing physician, and I'd say one of the most creative scientists I've ever had the pleasure to work with. So it was in Wrocław, Poland, at the International Society of Dynamical Games, that in 2008 I said, I'll join you. And so it is at that moment that Tom Vincent and Bob Gatenby selected my next study organism, cancer. Then in 2017, after working with them, since about 2009, 2017, then Moffitt very kindly hired me and had the opportunity then of joining the Department of Integrated Mathematical Oncology. So these are the buddies, the postdocs, the faculty that I have a pleasure to be able to work with. And what do we try to do in integrated mathematical oncology? And this really describes then what I do and what my role is to be kind of a bridge person between trying to apply mathematical models, try to apply that to cancer biology, and then how can that be brought directly into the clinic? And so a lot of my role has been to bridge things. The people that are going to be important directly to the research that I'm going to show you today then is Jingsong Zhang, who's behind our prostate cancer trial, Jessica Cunningham, now a graduate student at Maastricht University and still employed at Moffitt, who has been a long-time research technician then with Bob, Mark Lloyd, he was my first graduate student in cancer biology, and he's absolutely wonderful. And then the one who's standing behind the sign up there is Paul Orlando, and he was one of my grad students working in Africa, but at the same time got interested in cancer and was able to split his PhD then between the ecology of primates and the ecology of cancer. So if you go into the National Cancer Institute website, heck, go into the EU website, you'll see that cancer is described as a disease of the genes, or it's described as a gene of unregulated proliferation. But I would like to also add to you that may be lacking is that in fact cancer, once it has initiated, is really a disease of Darwinian evolution, of ecological and evolutionary dynamics. So this is the way that I like to sort of see the process of cancer. You may have a sequence of somatic mutations. You may even, as Josh showed us, already have a jump on the gun, be ahead of the game. And at what point then you have initiation, a breakdown of homeostasis, you have initiation, ductal carcinoma in situ, some sort of adenoma that might be in a colon, and then at that point you have very limited opportunity for Darwinian evolution because there's not much space. In Darwinian evolution, and we all know this, but it's good to be reminded of this, is creative destruction. if a cell never proliferates, if a cell lineage never gives rise to both proliferation and death, you will never have evolution by natural selection. And then finally, breakout, the cancer then spreads. Perhaps at this point it becomes clinical. I'm going to argue it becomes a disease of extensive evolution. So Carlo very kindly put up the hallmarks of cancer. And what I'd like to do is take Carlo's invitation, and he knows this well, and unwind it. And I think, of course, I've discovered in the cancer world that eye candy seems to be critical. Now, as an ecologist, Rodrigo understands this. We don't have much money. We often don't have artistic talent. I'm sorry, Rodrigo, you may well, but not me. And so for me, it was a real eye-opener to come into cancer and see these really splashy figures, and they're really wonderful. But in this case, I think this figure is misleading. This figure as a color wheel gives you sort of the impression that each of these are on the same level of significance, that they somehow spin around like a wheel. In fact, wheel of fortune, guys. Or is it wheel of misfortune? We'll just spin it and see what you get. But in fact, I think when you unravel it, what you'll see is, I think, evolution in 3 stages. So this is a figure from a paper with Athena, Amy, Carlo, all names that have come up since we've been here. And if you kind of imagine survival proliferation trade-offs, and then what you'll see is out at the boundary there are some constraints. There are physiological, chemical, and physical constraints on just how much cell proliferation you can have, how much cell survival you can have. And one of the great life history trade-offs is survival versus proliferation. It exists for all organisms. It has to exist for cancer. So let's imagine that boundary line out at the edge. That represents the ultimate evolutionary potential. Clearly, when a normal cell starts to dysfunction, begins to show unregulated proliferation, it has to be well inside that line. It's not going to be on that line. The normal cells of our body do not proliferate or even survive anywhere near their capacity to do so. So in this case, then, cancer initiation starts way down there. So you have cancer initiation. Then you probably have a bout of fairly straightforward natural selection. You can improve in everything. You are so far away from what is evolutionarily optimal that you can improve in all regards. So there's that squiggle line I'll call early progression. And then finally, you hit the trade-off line. And that's where almost all organisms exist in evolutionary time. That is the point in which if an organism wants to improve in one regard, it's going to sacrifice in some other trait or characteristic. And I think we can understand then the hallmarks of cancer exactly in that context. So I'm going to take the hallmarks of cancer and point out that the first, you got 3 over there: resisting programmed cell death, evading anti-growth signals, enabled reproductive mortality. Those are all the 3 adaptations that every organism needs to even be in the game. In the absence of these 3 traits, the elephants wouldn't exist. In the absence of these 3 traits, rabbits wouldn't be rabbits. So these 3 traits are what are required to have cancer as a speciation event, where you as a multicellular organism actually gives rise to a new single-cell life form. And for that to be a single-cell life form, it has to be a unit of selection. It goes from being part of the whole organism program to becoming the program. In a sense, it gains agency. It gains evolutionary agency. The next 3, deregulated cell metabolism, simply stop doing what you were doing for the whole organism. That's a waste of energy and time. Genetic instability, remember, you have a lot of evolutionary catching up to do. So you evolve evolvability. Evolution itself becomes Evolvability itself becomes an adaptation. Sustained growth signaling, well, that makes a lot of sense. If you're requiring growth or co-feeding from the normal cells, becomes self-sufficient. And then finally, when you look at the last 4, those are all pretty sophisticated adaptations. At this point, this is becoming a pretty good elephant. These are pretty amazing adaptations. They're resource limited. So engineering your environment to bring in more blood. Tumor-promoting inflammation that brings in all these handy cells that begin to feed you and do nice things for you. Room service. Avoiding immune responses. That's one of the most fundamental trade-offs in nature. Food versus safety. Be safe. And then finally, tissue invasion and metastasis. That becomes, as Ken so very aptly discussed earlier, he focused on this as the endgame adaptation. an adaptation that ultimately burns down the entire house, destroys the entire environment. Gosh, I wonder where we humans are on the planet right now. What stage are we at in terms of what we're doing to the earth? So, for me then, cancer, like life, is a complex dynamical system. Secondly, it's hierarchical from molecules to tumor ecosystems. And then what I'm interested in, and we'll try to present to you today, it's the product of evolution by natural selection. So what does that mean? Natural selection can be studied in three ways. It can be studied through the recipe of inheritance. It can be studied through phylogenies, the various relationship of the cancer cells as they progress and metastasize, and they can be studied as their fit of form and function. As an ecologist, what I find very interesting is cancer has developed intellectually in almost the opposite direction as ecology. Ecology began with the fit of form and function, describing all the wonderful adaptations of that aardvark. Eventually, ecology began to study phylogeny, and eventually, for some organisms, we even have a whole genome sequence. But guess what? We're not even close to a whole genome sequence on an aardvark. We have no idea. We roughly know its relationship. It's part of the Aphrotheria, so it sort of is an elephant wannabe, but never made it. On there, it went a different path. On the other hand, if we look at the cancer cell, it's almost the opposite. We can have whole genome sequencing. We can do RNA-seq. 20 minutes, send it off to the M2 gen and get the whole sequence. Furthermore, we study their phylogenies. But in terms of fit of form and function, what are the actual adaptations that allow a cancer cell to be good at what it does? I would say we are still in its infancy. And so I'm going to turn a phrase around. It's very popular to put up there, Carlo. It was wonderful to see Dobzhansky's line. Nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. Dobzhansky made that line because the field was dominated by ecology and failed to appreciate evolution. If Dobzhansky was here today and listening to cancer, he would say nothing in evolution makes sense except in light of ecology. So the first line is an enabling line. It enables us to believe that by simply sequencing genes, understanding methylation patterns, that we are understanding the system. We need to understand the ecology. So what happens with fit of form and function? Cancer cells evolve adaptations to their environment. Phenotypic plasticity permits tumor cells to at first acclimate, and then eventually they adapt. Each of us in this room can acclimate. We can adjust to our surroundings. None of us in this room can truly adapt in the sense of evolution by natural selection. Adaptation is an intergenerational process of births and deaths. Acclimation is that capacity to adjust your behavior appropriately for where you are. So cancer cells likely first acclimate. That may even be the persister cells before the next big moment, and then we can expect them to adapt. I'm going to take Darwin's postulates. Carlo had them up there in a lovely fashion, but I'm going to highlight one aspect of Darwin that I think gets forgotten. First, we need heritable variation. Like begets like with mistakes. But the second key component of evolution by natural selection is a struggle for existence. All organisms have the capacity to produce more offspring than can possibly survive. This sets up the opportunity then for creative destruction, the third postulate. So the struggle for existence are the two laws of ecology. Law number one, all populations have the capacity to grow exponentially under ideal conditions. Law number two, no population can grow exponentially forever, not even humans. Eventually, there will be limits to growth, there will be competition, there will be limiting factors. So the tumor is sort of a viscous chemostat. So if I, as an ecologist, you ask me, what is the ecosystem like for a cancer? It fits this sort of viscous ecotype. You've got a bunch of blood vessels coming in. You've got this swamp of cells. They exist in a highly limited environment. And then fluids or bloods eventually leak out of this viscous chemostat. What is a population? And I like to go through this because we often don't think very deeply, myself included, when we're making models of tumor growth or tumor development. Many of you have seen models. And that is, what really is a population? Total number of tumor cells, some sort of volume, tumor cells per density, percent cover, occupancy. And I show this graph again to kind of illustrate how, as an ecologist, one can begin to think about the actual ecology going on in a tumor. So what this shows, this map isn't particularly good, but there's a muskrat. And a Bohemian prince in the early 1900s who had a fish pond full of vegetation, he thought it'd be a good idea to import muskrats from Canada and drop them in his pond. And indeed, when he dropped in his pond, it worked better than he could have imagined. The muskrats not only cleared out the vegetation in his pond, they began to spread into his neighbor's pond. And they spread and they spread. Each of those lines shows you in Austria, Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, shows the complete spread of the muskrat year by year. It is one of the most fantastic examples of tumor growth. That range map is the tumor. The leading edge is that continued expansion. They made it into the Netherlands by 1975, at which point the Dutch discovered they burrow through dikes. The Dutch now spend 8 million euros a year patching up holes that are too big for a finger. The muskrats are just now making it down through France. Isn't that nice? They're here. They're now making it into southern France, and they're on their way to Spain. If they can just kind of work their way through Catalan, they will be there. But the key point is that while, yes, we can look at the entire advance of the muskrats in the same way we look at the growth of the tumor, but the tumor does not grow. It is the range size of the cancer cells. The tumor does not evolve. You do not treat the tumor. You are treating the cancer cells within them. And if you go back to that particular spot in the early 1900s, and I've had the pleasure of going there, it's kind of an ecological pilgrimage site. You can go to the very spot where the muskrats were released. I was there a few years ago. There's still muskrats there. And guess what? A muskrat came out and smiled at me. It was like good karma at this spot. But what it means is the muskrats have been being born and dying ever since this moment. Go back to that pond, and you now have had over 50 generations of muskrats have come and gone. The muskrats at that pond have no idea that their brethren are in France. They have no idea that their brethren are burrowing holes in the Netherlands. Their ecology is a pond and a few neighboring ponds. And so when we talk about the tumor microenvironment or imagine the context of the ecological theater for a cancer cell, it's probably a very small neighborhood. Cancer cells really have no interaction with or direct knowledge of cancer cells that are probably more than just 40 or 50 cells away. So by the time you have 9 billion cancer cells, that's quite substantial. Now, how about the evolutionary potential? This is just a conjecture that I'm putting up there. We know that nature is a rather dull subset of what is evolutionarily feasible and what is ecologically acceptable. Hopefully, most of you can find your favorite dog up there. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There's actually about 200, 250 known breeds. And I want you to imagine the experiment. We take 100 individuals of all 200 breeds, 20,000 dogs. Oh, wait. 20,000 dogs. And we release them on the Serengeti, a beautiful game park. How do you think the dogs would do? How about the Chihuahuas? How are our Chihuahuas doing? You're kind of in trouble, right? How about those beautiful water dogs, the retrievers? They see a water hole and they jump right in without looking. There's a reason why you look before you jump into an African water hole. So this experiment's been done. This experiment's been done, and basically you wind up with a dingo. Whether you're in the Smoky Mountains of the United States, the Middle East with Bedouin dogs, wild dogs become free in Tanzania, you take that evolutionary potential and what you wind up is basically a dingo. And so I would offer to you that even though we marvel at the amount of genetic variability that we see in cancer, in fact, it's likely that what we see at any given time is a very, very dull subset. Because the ecology of the tumor, the spread of the muskrat, has already caused most of that variability to be ecologically unsuccessful and is not going to be present. So I think one of the kind of most interesting questions, and I'll kind of go in kind of cancer, is shown up here in this figure. So the bottom one, we see this figure quite a bit. I kind of call this one, let's see, I call this sort of the spilt milk sort of theory of genetic variability in cancers. And that is, you just get more and more genetic mutations. These genetic mutations kind of spread out like milk on a table that's been spilt. Then eventually there's therapy, and suddenly that's the big witching hour. There's some resistant cells in there. They make it through, and then they begin the whole process again. In ecology, we don't see that. Maybe because of sexual reproduction. There's lots of reasons this may be so. But in ecological systems, we see niche filling. We have some sort of adaptive landscape, and there's only certain types, certain species that are ecologically acceptable. So cancers, instead of being an infinite amount of genetic variability, may in fact have Darwin's finches. So part of my research and my interest then is, can we find some of the Darwin's finches? They're all closely related. So my favorite animals are squirrels. And these two squirrels, the fox squirrel and the gray squirrel, are both in my backyard in Chicago. They're found throughout the Midwest. In the United States, this is the one that's invasive in Europe now. This is the one that's a scourge. If you go to England, Kiel, parts of the Netherlands, much of Tuscany now, they like olives. I think they like grapes there as well. They're now in Spain. But anyway, that's not so important. The important part is, how do these two squirrels that are so similar, they're ecologic, they're evolutionarily related, they're sister taxa, how do they coexist? What are their niches? Well, it turns out this guy is actually a much better competitor. This one, the gray squirrel, is much, much better at competing with other squirrels. Sorry if that's why your red squirrels in Kiel aren't doing so well. That these guys, the fox squirrel, their specialty is avoiding predators. They are anti-predator specialists. And again, a fundamental trade-off, food and safety. These guys excel in the safe habitat. These guys excel in the risky habitat. Here you see a fox squirrel actually going up and screaming at a hawk, its predator. It's actually screaming at its predator. You can see that hawk is just like so embarrassed. This is like so embarrassing. I hope my friends don't see me. I hope this doesn't make it out on Twitter or Facebook that my food was actually attacking me. So if we look at scale of heterogeneity inside a tumor, the edge of the tumor and the interior of the tumor make obvious habitats. We can also surmise that the edge of the tumor is more exposed to the immune system. The interior of the tumor is going to be more competitive. So as a consequence, what we can expect then is to actually find gray squirrels on the interior of the tumor and fox squirrels on the edge of the tumor. And that's exactly what we found. We use CA9 as our marker for fox squirrels, CA12 as our marker then for gray squirrels, surmising that these create anti-predator, anti-immune, niche construction possibilities, and the data couldn't even be better than fox squirrels and gray squirrels. We find exactly that pattern. We look at a bunch of other markers, it holds up, and eventually what we see then is very distinct habitat segregation. And in the interior of the tumor, all these blue guys are gray squirrels, all of these yellow guys are fox squirrels. This held up over 18 women with stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3 breast cancer. So these happen very, very quickly. We also found that in breast cancer as well, looking at ER positive and ER negative breast cancer. Same pattern, near blood, ER positive, away from blood, ER negative. And so we're interested then in applying landscape ecology principles to analyzing tumors and tumor circumstances. But what I want to conclude on, it's kind of this part one then, is now therapy. So we told you sort of the ecology of the tumor, what we can expect in an ecosystem. Therapy is a predator-prey game. As soon as the oncologist administers therapy, it's game on. Wittingly or unwittingly, that physician, all the physicians in here, as soon as you show your hand, you have entered an evolutionary game with the cancer cells. But the important part is we can anticipate. The cancer cells cannot anticipate. And that becomes kind of the segue then for the next part of the talk, and that is evolutionarily enlightened management, which is used in integrated pest management. I work in fisheries management as well, that's used in that context. Appreciating, modeling, and or anticipating the ecological and evolutionary consequences of management, conservation, and therapy. So this brings us then to evolutionary therapies, which I'm interested in, and that's going to be using models and measures of the past and present state of the individual patient's cancer to anticipate and steer. That's the key part. Anticipate and steer the ecological and evolutionary dynamics with the goal then of improving quality of life or lengthening life. Thank you.